Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Bullish or Bearish. My name is Tony Chu, and I'm from Success Options Group, and I'm here with my sister Angela, who you'll see in a couple seconds. And we're just bringing you another episode this week where we discuss some of the hot financial topics that you're seeing in social media or wherever you're looking.
So really, we're going to give you both sides of a story and let you kind of make your own decision after kind of listening about like the pros and cons of like the different, of the different topics. But today's topic is actually something that's actually kind of interesting to me because we're actually going to be talking about monopolies. And really, a lot of people, when they hear the word monopoly, there's almost like an instinct of this is a terrible idea. But that's not actually true. I think people don't realize just how many monopolies are in existence and are already out there that we take advantage of. Like there is actually a lot of good things to go with monopolies. I mean, because if you even think about it, one of them, like a couple of the main monopolies out there that we might not even think about is like our utilities, like electric, water, our railway system, our bus systems, like all of those things are actually technically monopolies. And that actually stabilizes our price for using those items and also provides services when, like, for instance, like railway, you have peak hours and off hours. If it was a non-monopoly, they would only have services during peak hours and you'd be like screwed off hours. But because they're a monopoly, they provide services all the time.
Okay, so I hear you, and you're mentioning the monopolies that are kind of more government managed or like they're putting strict restrictions. But I think, I'll admit it too. I love some monopolies. I'm a big Amazon shopper or like Walmart and Target. But the problem with those kind of monopolies, where it's more of a free market system versus like the government controlled entities you were describing, is that you don't get price discovery, right? And we kind of talked about this a little bit in our price controls video like last time. But if you're a monopoly, you can set the price to whatever you want, right? And without any kind of price discovery, you're kind of at the whims of the monopoly itself, right? And the big one, like I talked about, like Walmart, everybody loves the great cheap prices at Walmart, but the downside of that is it killed all the small businesses, right? They just, there's no small businesses left because of the Walmart. And we all have to look at ourselves a little bit for that as well.
Okay, so I totally get what you're talking about with the whole like impact on smaller businesses and all of that things. But aside from that, okay, yes, it's terrible. The small businesses are going out of business. All right. But the thing is look at how many people prefer going to Walmart, prefer going to like using Amazon because it's a one-stop shop. And not only that, in order for them to stay like, at the top where everybody wants to use them instead, they have to keep up with their service. They have to keep relevant. They have to do innovation to like actually make sure that they are the place that people will continue going to. Because the thing is that not all small businesses went out of business. I mean, if you had a unique, niche in your business, you could still survive against these big businesses because they didn't offer that unique service or that unique niche that you're handling. So it's not that, you can't, do something about it. It's just that monopolies offer so much, like, I guess, convenience that everybody wants. And the thing is, not like, I'll admit that there are some monopolies that, yes, they set the prices, but that also allows for them to put more money into stuff like R&D. And they can actually put less money for some monopolies into like things like marketing and advertisement. Because I mean, this is not true for pharmaceutics because pharmaceutics, does do marketing and advertising. But the thing is like pharmaceutics is technically a bunch of companies that is a monopoly. But how much of that money goes into like actually needing to research new drugs? Because if they didn't have patents and the ability to have that kind of thing, nobody would research new medications and they'd be like, okay, like nothing happening.
So I'm glad you mentioned pharmaceuticals because that's one of those big monopolies that I don't think that everybody would necessarily agree with what you just said, Angela, right? I mean, we did that video on cost plus drugs, right? So that's innovation where generics, and you'll find that certain pharmaceutical companies are charging like they're making so much more than what Mark Cuban and Cost Plus Drugs are selling those generics for. I know you're talking about R&D, but I would really go against what you said about innovation. Like, I don't think necessarily they're a monopoly is enticed to innovate all the time, right? Because they're kind of good. They're like, what I can name some examples where they're stuck on their laurel, right? They're just sitting around like, well, you're a captive audience, like taxi cabs. That's the big one I can. So not until like Uber and Lyft came in, they innovated that industry, the ride sharing industry. I mean, before then, you had taxi cabs. You go to New York, there's yellow taxi cabs everywhere, and then you're kind of like stuck to pay whatever that was, right? And now you have choices and you have price discovery. And that's not necessarily true when it was just the taxi cab and the medallions and all that kind of stuff.
But the thing is that that's actually also another thing that proves that just because a monopoly exists does not mean that other people cannot get into the market by coming up with something innovative. So that does not kill off all possibilities. It just means that you have to be smarter, you have to be innovative. Because think about it, as a search engine, doesn't Google have a monopoly? I mean, they have to be innovative so that everybody prefers the Google search engine. I mean, technically there's a Yahoo search engine or a Bing search engine. I mean, there are other search engines out there, but first thought that comes to your mind when you need to do a search online, you go to Google. Google has to keep up with their creation, their innovation, their outreach to people to make them the most comfortable, the one that everybody prefers to use. And same thing with Apple. I mean, Apple has a huge market share. It's almost kind of like partial monopoly as well. They have to keep up with like the innovation, what their customers want in order to keep that market share. So just because there's a monopoly out there does not mean that other people cannot come into that market. It just means that you have to be smarter, you have to be better and more creative.
So now that you mentioned search engines and like like the Googles and the Apples and that stuff, this is where another thing is like, so you mentioned like their innovation in the search engines, but the downside of that is their customer service usually goes down as well. And what I mean by that is there's been a lot of discussion about privacy and your data and what Facebook, what Google and all them, what they get, what data they get from their users, right? And how they repackage and sell that for ads. And, it's been actually a very big topic as a recent, and that's because to a certain degree, they don't necessarily care about their customers, their users. They're selling them as the product to advertisers, right? And they're making money on ads because they're doing that. So that's really where you get into this. Monopolies care a little bit less about their customers, right? And they can tend to get off mission in a sense, right? And they're going after money, right?
Okay, so there are like negative aspects, but the thing is that there's also other things that monopolies are able to do, because think about it, in order to be internationally competitive, if they're a monopoly, they are able to like actually compete with other big companies that are known internationally. Like a US monopoly can compete with like a monopoly from China kind of thing. You know what I mean? If they didn't have that kind of background power and that kind of market share, it would be harder for them to like, keep like good kind of standing in the international market. Plus, we've just gone through a whole COVID thing, where we had 2 years of impacted earnings. Monopolies have the backup cash, the actual reserve to actually survive something like that, so that you actually get consistent, like constant, like supply, you know what I mean? Where you don't have to worry about your stuff suddenly disappearing. Like it is still always available because they have a consistent chain.
Okay, so then now that you talk about a consistent supply and chain, let's talk about one of the biggest monopolies going right now is oil, right? Crude oil. And you have this monopoly, OPEC, right? OPEC plus Russia, whatever, where they're keeping a price floor on crude oil. And, all of us are feeling it with inflation and with gases and like gasoline, right? It's just that, there's a monopoly on oil and they're keeping it artificially necessarily high. or they're putting a price floor actually, but basically what that means is that, we're not getting true price discovery. They're not like, people aren't those countries are not competing against each other for this global market that you're talking about, right? This global industry where each one can kind of supply crude oil, about the same kind of degree of quality, but they're not, because it's a monopoly.
So really, and we've talked about a lot of different examples in this, in this video, but what it really boils down to is there are a lot of good aspects to a monopoly and a lot of negative aspects to monopoly. And it actually depends on every single industry. So it's like, it's a case-based system. Like sometimes in some places, like I talked about before, where government can actually do more regulation, it is like really good, like for transportation, utilities, and that kind of thing. We need the monopoly so that we can make sure that services are provided, consistently and at an affordable cost. Whereas, as Tony was saying earlier, is that there are some areas where monopolies, may not be the best choice, especially if the government can't regulate it as well, or there's some discussion about how the government can help regulate it to make it more fair for the consumers.
Yep. So make sure you hit the like, hit the subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Put some comments below in the area where you put comments, and we'll see you next time.